Agility Summit. I am here with our first speaker, Bjarte Bogsnes. He has a long international career with over 20 years of leadership experience in finance and HR. But I think the most impressive part for me from his career is that he managed to take big financial departments and change the way they do things and bring them closer to agility with something called beyond budgeting. And he is a pioneer in the beyond budgeting movement. He has been heading up the implementation of beyond budgeting at Equinor, former Statoil, the Scandinavia's largest company. And it's interesting to me as a person who has done a lot of transformations that we often start from, let's say, development teams or production teams. And then after we figure out how to organize this, we end up hitting walls with other departments, with HR, with finance, where we still have ways of working that deal with yearly based feedback cycles or yearly based budgets or things like that. So this is why I understand the value of this idea, and I also understand how hard it can be to do this. And because of this, I'd like to welcome Bjarte Bogsnes, who will talk about beyond budgeting. Welcome, Bjarte. You have the stage.
Thank you very much, and hello, everybody out there. I've been really looking forward to this session today. It was definitely not given that I should sit here today and talk about beyond budgeting, because my career started in a very different place. I joined Statoil, as we were called back then, in 1983, in the corporate budget department, where I became the manager the year after. So I have been heading up more budget processes in that job, in other finance manager jobs in different places in Europe, more budget processes than I want to be reminded about. I have done a lot of stupid things in my life, but it also means that I know what I'm talking about. Also relevant, as you heard, I've been working in human resources as well, heading up an HR function for 4 years, highly relevant for what I will talk about today. What I want to share with you today is first the bad news, which I think you are painfully aware of, the problems with traditional management, which goes way beyond budgeting problems. But this is where we need to start, because this problem is bigger than especially what many finance people think it is. Fortunately, there are solutions beyond budgeting. I heard it being described as financial agility. I would actually disagree somewhat, because beyond budgeting is about business agility. It is about how to run an organization in an agile way, where the finance part and stuff also needs to be included. But every time I say beyond budgeting, I would like you to think business agility, because that is what this is. That name was simply not invented when we hit the road more than 20 years ago. So I'm going to talk about the model, and then I want to share with you a few fascinating cases before we move to the main case today, which is the model we have in Equinor, as we know are called, ambition to action. We started out 15 years ago, so we have quite some experience after all these years. There is one word that keeps coming up every time I talk about beyond budgeting, and that is the word control. And the context is the fear of losing control. But when I ask people, what do you mean with control, with this thing you are so afraid of losing? Most people go quiet after they have said cost control. They actually struggle with defining what they are so afraid of losing, which I find a bit interesting. If we go to Oxford Dictionary, there's a formal definition of control. It says that it's the power to influence or direct people's behavior or the course of events. And what does this mean in company business terms, organizational terms? I think it means that it's about controlling people and controlling the future. And here, behind these two, lies the two main assumptions that underpins so much of traditional management. First, people can't be trusted, and second, the future is predictable and plannable. We are challenging heavily both those assumptions in Beyond Budgeting because we think they are very much illusions of control. For instance, that people can and must be managed. Of course, you can manage people, but if people are managed in stupid ways, they typically find their way around in order to get their job done. And when it comes to the future, the only thing we know is that we don't know. And COVID-19, the situation we are into right now, is a good example of both here, because all the homework have shown that people actually can be trusted, even if they are not directly supervised. And the only thing we know about 2021 is that we don't know. The world is today full of dead 2020 budgets. Talking about people and trust, I used to travel a lot before COVID, and I spent more nights at hotels than I want to be reminded about. The first thing I always checked when I entered the hotel room was what kind of hangers do they have to put on my clothes. And as you know, there are typically two types that we meet. And I think we can all agree that the one on top here is the most user-friendly. I simply hate the lower one. So why do then some hotels have this stupid lower one? Well, I think the reason is that maybe there was a few hotel guests once that stole one of those ordinary hangers with a crook. And what was the response, the reaction? To punish everybody because somebody did something wrong, which is actually one of the problems of traditional management. You should not put everybody in jail because somebody did something wrong. There are wise people out there who agreed with what I've been saying about people and the future. Talking about people, good old Peter Drucker, most of what we call management is about making it difficult for people to do their job. And I couldn't agree more. Sometimes that is the problem. We are managing too much. And when it comes to the future and planning the future, there was another wise person, Russell Eckhoff. And he compared a lot of the corporate planning he was observing with a ritual rain dance. It has no effect on the weather, but those who engage in it think it does. And I understand what he's talking about. I have done a lot of dancing in my life. I don't really think it really helped on the performance of the company. Okay, so much for wise people. Imagine an organization that 100 years ago invented a fantastic machine, which was state-of-the-art and crucial for the success of this organization. 50 years ago, this machine started to make some trouble, didn't work that well, and today this machine is completely broken. It looks like this. You will all understand that this is not a true story, because in real life, people would have gotten together 50 years ago to try to do something. Maybe try to fix the machine, or even better, try to invent a better machine, because innovation is something we all love. Innovation is great. We all want to be leading edge, unique, right there in the forefront, better than everybody else. Wonderful. But there is also that enthusiasm for innovation that seems to be limited to technology innovation into products and services. But there is also something called management innovation that we will talk about today. It's about exploring new ways of leading and managing. And management innovation, that is not great. That is scary, right? Kicking out the budget, are you crazy? The consequence is that it's very crowded on the left-hand side. Everybody is into that kind of innovation in some form or shape. The management innovation arena, however, that is not yet a crowded place because it's scary. But that is good news for brave companies who dare to explore, embrace also this kind of innovation, because you can get just as much performance, competitive advantage from management innovation as you can get from technology innovation. And there are companies out there who openly admit that we have no advantage whatsoever in what we produce and what we sell. We find it in the way we lead and manage. And I've got a few examples for you in a minute. But before we talk more about that important word performance, it is still called beyond budgeting. It has something to do with budgets. It has something to do with budget problems. So before we move on, I'd like to share with you my budget problem list, which is quite long, by the way. It's a very time-consuming process, making budgets, following up budgets. Some people think this is the biggest problem. I disagree, but it does belong on the list. Assumptions quickly outdated. Well, you know all about that during these special times. This is a serious problem. Budgeting can stimulate what I would call unethical behaviors. The lowballing, the gaming, the sandbagging, the resource hoarding, the internal negotiations. That's not the kind of behavior we would like to see. It can create these illusions of control that we talked about. And of course, it can feel comfortable to have next year described with a million details and decimals. But again, the only thing we know is that it's wrong. So if we don't have control, whatever the word means, it is better to acknowledge that we don't have control and act accordingly, than to think that we have control and act accordingly. Budgeting often forces us to make decisions too early. We have to make these decisions in the autumn the year before. And in big organizations, too many of these decisions are taken high. Budgeting can prevent, or budgets can prevent us from doing things we should have done, but we can't because it's not in the budget. But this also works the other way around. It can lead us to do things we shouldn't have done, but it is in the budget and it is spend it or lose it. And linked to that, don't forget that budgeting, yes, I agree, they can be a very effective ceiling on cost, but they are just as effective as a floor in the sense that these budgets tend to be spent for the reasons that we know just talked about. To define good performance as hitting the budget number is a very narrow, mechanical way of defining performance. We need a richer, broader performance language. And last but not least, one problem that actually many people haven't thought about is something I've called conflicting purposes. And I'll come back to that a little bit later. I have been sharing this list of problems with hundreds of thousands of people around the world in the 25 years I've been working with Beyond Budgeting. And most people agree, executives, managers, finance people, others. But at the same time, most companies continue doing this stupid stuff. And one reason could be that these problems are regarded more as some kind of irritating itches and not symptoms of a bigger problem. But that is exactly what these problems are. They are symptoms of a huge problem, which is also a paradox. Because here we have a process invented roughly 100 years ago. And in case you don't know it, the inventor was James O. McKinsey, the founder of McKinsey Consulting. I never met Mr. McKinsey, but I actually think that his intentions were the best. He wanted to help companies perform better. And I'm sure this worked 100 years ago, maybe even 50 years ago. But today, this way you're managing, this way you're thinking, is doing exactly the opposite. It has become more of a barrier than a support for getting out the best possible performance in organizations. And if that isn't a big problem, then I don't know what is a big problem. So we are back to this important word, performance. And some of you might know that I like to use traffic as a metaphor when I talk about performance. Because in traffic, when we are out driving, we would also like to experience good performance. And for me, that would mean a safe and good flow. I simply hate traffic jams. And by the way, I never understood why they call it the rush hour. There's no rush at all. Those cars are standing dead still, but there's so much I don't understand. Anyway, I think traffic authorities, they want the same. And this is something we often meet to make that happen. This traffic light has no sensor. There's no high tech. The one who is in control here, who makes decisions about when you have to stop and when you can drive, is the one who programmed this light. And where would this person be as you sit there waiting for that green light? Well, somewhere else. And the information that this programming would be based on would not be entirely fresh information. It would be some historical trends, maybe some forecasts. but again, not entirely fresh information. Fortunately, there is an alternative, a very different solution with exactly the same purpose. We are talking about the roundabout. Here, we as drivers are in control. We make decisions, and we base our decisions on fresh, real-time, here and now information. So very different answers to the same questions. So it could be interesting to compare a bit more these two ways of managing. So let's do that, and I've got a few leading questions for you here. Which of these two is normally most efficient? Well, it's proven scientifically that the roundabout is not just more efficient, it's also actually safer. Which is most difficult to drive in? Which takes most competence? Of course, it's the roundabout. And going back to our organizations, everything we need to leave behind of traditional management is in many ways much easier for everybody involved than what we need to move towards. But we cannot go for what's easy because it is easy. We have to go for the stuff that is best for performance, even if it is more difficult. And leadership is actually not meant to be easy. A few other words that is relevant here. Trust, obviously, in front of that light. We are not trusted to make decisions. In the roundabout, we are. Transparency is not important in front of that light. As long as you can see the color, you can make your decision. In the roundabout, you need to see everything before you can make your decision. And finally, in the roundabout, you need to be present, in the situation, whereas in front of that light, you can sit and close and listen to the radio and let the mind move on. Words, language is important in the stuff that we are talking about now. And there are some labels in the corporate language that I don't like. One of those labels is performance management. Two reasons for that. First of all, I find it quite negative, because what you basically are saying is that if you don't manage your performance, there will be no performance, which is not true. The second reason is that I think there is quite a lot of illusion into that belief that performance can be managed. I think our ability to manage performance in today's people and business realities is quite limited compared to what we often like to think as executives or managers or finance people or HR people. But performance management is a label that fits very nicely when we talk about the traffic light. Because that is what traffic authorities are doing very directly. In the roundabout, it is actually about something else. It is more about creating conditions for great performance to take place. It is about enabling performance, not managing performance. And this is more than playing with words. These are two fundamentally different ways of addressing that key question: how do we get the best possible performance in our organizations? And as you saw on the previous slide, there's also one other word that is important here. We are talking about values and values-based management. And the opposite we can maybe call rules-based management. The traffic light is a good example of rules-based management. Red is stop and green is drive. We can always discuss yellow. If there is a mindset, a value set among drivers waiting for that green light, which is about me first, I don't care about the rest. That mindset is normally not a big problem in front of that light. But in the roundabout, me first, I don't care about the rest, is a big problem. Because see, we are much more dependent on everybody involved sharing a positive common wish or purpose of wanting this to flow well. We have to help each other. We have to interact with each other in a very different way than what we need to do in front of that light. So it's not enough with fresh information or authority to act on it. You also need a positive value. We are going to leave traffic. The roundabout is a more self-regulating way of managing, and self-regulation is another important word here. Because in today's people and business realities, organizations need more self-regulating management models for at least two reasons. The first reason has to do with our business environment and all the volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity out there, all the VUCA. I'm almost getting tired of that label, but it is a reality. And if we take that VUCA seriously, it must have implications compared to if there is little or no VUCA out there. That should be quite obvious. The other thing we need to reflect on, the other reality we need to reflect on, is not external, it's internal. It has to do with people. Asking ourselves a simple but important question. What kind of people do we generally believe we have in our organization? And you're probably familiar with theory X and theory Y as one framework for talking about people, whereas you know theory X is the negative view on what people and what motivates people. A view that most people is a bunch of potential thieves and crooks that all must be managed tightly and kept on leashes. If not, we know what will happen. And then you have theory Y, very much the opposite view, a view that most people actually want to do a good job. They want to perform. They want to be involved. They want to be listened to. They want to be treated as adults. And whether we believe in X or Y must also have implications for how we design our management models. If we combine these two realities, it could look like this, and you recognize the two. And I would argue that traditional management lies in that lower left-hand corner, where the conscious or unconscious view that the world is still a predictable and plannable place, and that most people is on the X side. If we disagree with that, then this is not the place to be. Then we need to move up in that upper right-hand corner by addressing both leadership horizontally and our management processes vertically. And what we need to get out of traditional management is something that's very rigid, detailed, very annual, very rules-based. There's a lot of micromanagement and centralized command and control. There's a lot of secrecy and a strong belief in sticks and carrots as ways to drive performance. Again, if we don't believe that that is the right thing to do, we need to move in both directions. On the leadership side, we need to be not just more values-based, but also more purpose-based. There has to be more autonomy. There has to be more transparency. And I'll come back to one very important reason for more transparency in a minute. And last but not least, we need to build on that intrinsic or internal motivation and not fall in the trap of believing that individual bonus is the best way to motivate knowledge work. Because I'm sure you are aware of all the research telling us exactly the opposite. And about the power of mastery, autonomy, purpose, and belonging as opposed to money. I'm not saying money is not important, but it has been said wisely that you should pay people fairly and then get money off the table. I'm a big believer in common bonus schemes, by the way, but that's something very different. But it doesn't help to have these theory Y leadership visions if we have theory X management processes, because that creates poisonous gaps between what we preach and what we practice. So we need to change our management processes to better reflect what we hopefully mean and think about people, while also making our management processes more VUCA robust. Here are a few examples of what we typically need to do. Very often you have to do something with the traditional detailed annual budgets because they represent so much of what you find in that lower left-hand corner. More specifically, when we shall set targets, goals, ambitions, we should think a bit more like they do in football. I have yet to meet the football team who says that the ambition for next season is to score 42 goals and get 45 points. Those are budget goals, and they don't think like that. They think in terms of league tables, and it's all about doing well against peers and competition. Furthermore, we need more dynamics into our processes. Why shouldn't everything here circulate around the fiscal year of typically January to December? So where it makes sense, where it's possible, we need more event-driven, more business-driven, and less calendar-driven processes. And finally, when we shall evaluate what good performance is, it has to be about more than comparing two numbers and then comparing. And this, my friends, was a crash course in beyond budgeting. This is what it is about, trying to become more adaptive and more human, not necessarily as a goal in itself, but as you know, this is what it takes to survive, to thrive, and to outperform in today's and tomorrow's people and business realities. It is as simple and as difficult as this. A number of organizations are today on this journey in some form or shape. Here are some of them, and I could have talked for hours here about fantastic management innovation taking place. We don't have the time. So just a few quick examples. Upper left-hand corner, Miles, Norwegian IT company with business in Norway, the Baltics, India, South Africa. Miles have no budgets, no targets, just a lot of great performance. If you work for Miles, you can buy whatever PC you want, as expensive as you want, replace it as often as you want. You can attend whatever seminar, course, conference you want, as often as you want, wherever in the world. No travel budgets, no training budgets. But it's not an anarchy. They have a simple control mechanism. When you have bought that PC, when you have returned from that training, you need to put up on the intranet what you did and the cost of it. So transparency is their only control mechanism, and they are very happy with it. They have no plans of replacing it. The pioneer in the beyond budgeting movement is a bank that you see on top in the middle here. It's a Swedish bank called Handelsbanken. They have 850 branches in Northern Europe, quite big in the UK. Handelsbanken have no budgets, no targets, no individual bonus, and they have been operating like this since 1970 with huge success. Just look at the facts here. This bank has been performing better than the average of its competitors every single year since 1972. This is among the most cost-effective universal banks in Europe, and the bank has never needed any bailout or help from the authorities because they messed it up. It can't be a coincidence. A radically different management model compared to other banks. A lot of decentralization, a lot of autonomy, a lot of transparency, and these fantastic results over such a long time. So again, both Miles and Handelsbanken, there is nothing unique in what they produce and sell. They find it in the way they lead and manage. Handelsbanken and some other companies inspired what became known as beyond budgeting in the late 90s. These principles were formulated a few years before the Agile Manifesto. Many similarities, as you can see, but there was no contact whatsoever between those two communities at the time. That has fortunately changed now, and me speaking at this conference is just another example of that. I will not go through these principles in detail now, but just a few quick comments before we move on. You can see on the leadership side, we are talking about purpose, values, autonomy as some examples. And on the management process side, we are addressing rhythm. We are talking about other elements in management process, target setting, planning, forecasting, resource allocation, performance evaluation, and rewards. This is a pretty complete, comprehensive leadership and management model. And a key principle here is to create coherence between what we preach on the left-hand side and what we practice on the right-hand side. A classical example of the opposite. It doesn't help that we talk loud and warm on the left-hand side about how fantastic people we have on board, and we would be nothing without you, and we trust you so much. But not that much. Moving to management processes, kicking out the travel budget, are you crazy? Hypocrisy is what I call it. Poisonous gaps between what we preach and what we practice. There has to be consistency. Two classical misunderstandings around beyond budgeting. Some people think it's just about another way of managing cost. Well, it is, but there are 11 other principles. And on cost, we are not saying that cost is not important. We simply need better ways than what Mr. McKinsey could offer us. All right, let's move to Equinor, the ambition to action model. This is us in a nutshell. We are an energy company coming from oil and gas, but we know that the future will be low carbon and we will be part of it. So we are becoming a big player in offshore wind because that is stuff that we are pretty good at. When we started out in 2005, we were actually a bit careful with showing these 12 principles too widely because, you know, it's big stuff and it can scare people. If you scare people, you risk that you don't get started. So we started out in a less scary pace. we asked ourselves, why do we budget? And the budget has three different purposes: target setting, forecast, and resource allocation. And it might seem very efficient to do all three things in one process, one set of numbers, but that's also a problem. Because what happens if we ask for a good, we want to understand what next year could look like, we ask for a good number from salespeople, but they all know that that number will come back as a target for next year, maybe with a bonus attached to it. That might do something with the numbers submitted. Or if we ask people for good cost of investment numbers, they all know this is my only shot at getting access to resources for next year. And they all remember the 20% cuts last year. That memory might also impact the level of 9% upstairs. These are problems, not just because it destroys the quality of numbers, but also because it stimulates behaviors that we don't want to see. Fortunately, there is a very simple solution. We can still do these things, but they should be done in three different processes, because as you can see here, these are different things. And the beauty of separating is that that opens up a big improvement agenda. How can we set then much better targets? How can we operate with much better forecasts? And how can we develop a more intelligent resource allocation process compared to what Mr. McKinsey could offer us? And let me give you a little hint here on what we recommend on resource allocation. For the projects, we recommend something we call a dynamic resource allocation, where we say that the bank should be always open. The line can always forward a proposal for a project. Yes or no depends on two things: how good is the project, and can we afford it as things look today. So this is beyond budgeting versions of continuous delivery, not of software functionality, but of decisions and resources. And last but not least, how can we do all of this on a more event-driven and less calendar-driven rhythm? We can organize each of these on rhythms that suits not just each purpose, but also the type of business that we are into. And this is an important slide, because if you bring this to your finance colleagues, they will probably get this, understand it, and realize that starting like this is not dangerous. But if you do this, start like this, and when you start on those improvement discussions, you are already on a beyond budgeting journey. Because when you discuss targets, you will come into the discussion of what really motivates people, resource allocation, do we need detailed travel budgets if we say we push people, and so on and so on. All right, let's finish off with ambition to action, which is our process, our way of doing beyond budgeting. It is not the way, this is our way. Three purposes: translating strategy, managing risk, securing agility, and last but not least, activate our values and leadership principles. These are the steps in the process. It starts with translating strategy into strategic objectives. So what does success look like on a medium-term time horizon? Then what kind of risks do we have that can jeopardize or hinder us achieving these objectives? What kind of actions do we need to move towards those objectives, to mitigate risk? Very often it's one and the same thing. So that's why it's one process, one system. We also try to understand consequences of action. Then it's time for measuring that we are moving towards those objectives. The only problem with measurement is that measurement alone moves nothing. Nothing happens just because we measure. You don't lose weight simply by weighing yourself. And I know because I've tried. And that was not a big success. And this is also a reason why we call this stage indicators and not KPIs. Because the I in KPI stand for indicator. They are indicating that we are moving towards those objectives, but they are not necessarily telling the full truth. They are not called KPTs, key performance truth. They are called key performance indicators. We must never forget. Last but not least, what does all of this mean for you and me and the teams that we are in? And here is a very important principle in Equinor, which basically says that how we deliver is as important as what we deliver. And with how we deliver, we are talking about the values in the company. And the weighting between the two and all consequences for your career, what you pay, is 50-50. This is an integrated performance process running quite seamlessly from strategy via risk, via finance into human resources. We have worked very closely together to make it hang together because it must hang together. Here's an example of an ambition to action. You recognize the first 4 steps from the previous slide and then the HR process following on. And the 5 perspectives behind each arrow represent the following logic. We want to create value as expressed at the bottom. That will never happen unless we do well towards customers and market. That will never happen unless we do well on operations. That will never happen unless we do well on people and organization, and in our case, safety, security, and sustainability. So this is about winding back to all the things we need to do well on in order to create value. We have around 600 of these in the organization today, and let me spend a few minutes on this one because there are some important messages here. The first has to do with alignment. How do we create the red thread throughout here? We have a strategy that we want to implement. The easy way to do that is top-down cascading. And that means corporate simply instructing all the way down, this is the content of your ambition to action, especially when it comes to the numbers. And some finance people and some executives tend to like that kind of top-down cascading, because afterwards they can add up all the local numbers and it matches the corporate number down to the last decimal, and we can all sleep well at night. We are going to deliver because it all hangs together. Well, I wish it was that simple. In our culture, it isn't, because that top-down cascading easily destroys everything related to involvement, commitment, motivation. If your own ambition to action only is a landing ground for instructions from above, that ownership walks out the door. And then it doesn't help that the numbers add up. So that kind of alignment doesn't work, but we still need alignment. We create that through what we call translation, which means that when a team here shall either make a new ambition to action or update one, they will take a look around, one level up, further up, maybe all the way to corporate, left and right if they have business relations to kind of neighboring units. And then the teams will have a deep and good discussion. What does our ambition to action need to look like in order to support those that we have a relationship on ambition, on direction levels? If such a translation should go wrong, then of course the level above should do what they are paid for. But it's not the big problem. And the main reason is probably transparency, because all of these ambition to actions are open, accessible for all employees. There should be no place to hide with a stupid ambition to action. There are some share sensitive confidential things that we need to close, but that is something people understand. When it comes to rhythm, then these teams can in principle change whatever they want on their own ambition to action when there is a need for it. Including targets, if these targets have lost their meaning, impossible to achieve or become a piece of cake. But again, it is not an anarchy. On top of that transparency as a control mechanism, we have a very simple second mechanism. We say that if you want to change something that's big, you still need to have a talk with the level, or you do need to have a talk with the level above. If it's a small change, you simply inform the level above at a suitable time. Big or small, always make sure that you inform other units affected by your changes. This is the coordination part of it. When this was introduced, people said, great, I like this, but by the way, what is big and what is small? And some had expectations that we should define that on behalf of everybody. That is impossible. So we have delegated that. So it could be that somebody out there have a different definition of big and small than some others. But that is okay as long as it works both places. Think back to the roundabout, the self-regulation. We would like this to run as much as possible by itself. We shall not abdicate from corporate. We shall support when needed. We shall intervene if needed. But we would like these teams to perceive and experience ambition to action as something they have in order to help themselves to manage themselves. And if that works well, then the results on corporate are equally good. So ownership is very important here. And that's also why it's not mandatory to have an ambition to action. These teams decide for themselves. If we impose it, it is very easy easily seen as corporate, the corporate control tool. All right, let me finish off with another very important part of the model, the holistic performance evaluation. And holistic here means two things. First of all, the 50-50 between how we deliver and what we deliver, as I talked about. But holistic also means that when we shall evaluate what we have delivered in business terms, that should be an evaluation against the full ambition for action. And it should not just be about adding up the number of red and green indicators and then conclude. Because again, these are indicators. You know, as Albert Einstein said, not everything that counts can be counted, and not everything that can be counted counts. Wise words. So we need to move beyond measurement before we conclude by asking some simple questions. I see that your indicator is green, but have you really moved towards these strategic objectives? How ambitious were your targets? Should we punish someone who stretched and didn't completely make it? And do the opposite with somebody who lowballed and gamed and made it? Has there been significant changes in assumptions, headwind, tailwind of such a nature that it should be taken into account? How was the risks handled? And what is the sustainability of what you have delivered? It's only when you have been through these questions that we can have a view on what kind of performance are we looking at. And if you wonder how does this happen, well, this is just this happens in the performance dialogue between the manager and the one below. In some cases supported by finance and HR with some data. Some of these questions can also be relevant in the behavior evaluation against your behavior goals. The purpose of this evaluation has not changed. It is mainly about development and learning. There are still some links to rewards, even if we have been trying to weaken these links over the years, but there are still some links to for instance, base pay or merit pay. So this is what I wanted to share with you today. I hope there are some good questions now or later. These are my coordinates. If you want to follow me on Twitter, highly appreciated. I only tweet about beyond budgeting. There are no cats and dogs and grandchildren, I promise. And if you want to follow me on LinkedIn, also appreciated. And also check out the Beyond Budgeting Roundtable. It's a global network of organizations who together are on this journey where we are learning from each other. And also my apologies for the rush. This was the short version, 45 minutes. There is a long version. This book contains more of everything we've been talking about. Problems with traditional management, more about beyond budgeting, more cases, and also a case which was my first case. We kicked out the budget in a petrochemicals company called Borealis back in 1995, before there was anything called beyond budgeting. There's a chapter about beyond budgeting and agile, because there are so many similarities, and implementation advice from these two companies and also the 30 other companies that I've been helping along the way. I spent today roughly half of my time outside of Equinor helping organizations to get started. So that's it. Thank you very much. I'm looking forward to your questions.
Thank you, Bjarte. This was excellent and very insightful. There are a few comments already on the chat that you probably will find interesting. One person says, this idea what creates illusion of control sounds like impersonal life, but thinking of my experience in corporation, it's a very good observation. And I can attest as well, being a change agent often in corporations, I have to deal with illusions of control often. Mm-hmm. So that was one. Another one that I found very interesting is that leadership should be hard. I like what I feel like many managers feel that, it should be an easy job and it should be just, I don't know, about managing day-to-day things and so on, and not about the hard problems which you are talking about. So it's
and maybe it shouldn't be hard, but it is hard. It is a fact, right?
Yeah.
We all wish it was easier, but it is hard.
Yeah. And it's the same thing that I see with people switching to, on the technical side, to technical leadership. It's also becomes harder. There are a few questions here the people have asked. The first one was the biggest or most common challenge you've seen when trying to implement this throughout the companies you listed in your presentation.
If companies are listed, well, actually, we are a listed company. We are listed in the US and in Norway.
No, so not listed at stock exchange, but that you talked about in your presentation.
Which are the biggest problems?
Yes, the biggest problem that you faced.
Well, that's hard to say, but one problem in general that I didn't point out specifically on that list is that people said, well, this is what we always have done, and this is what everybody else is doing. And on that second one, I mean, that assumption is starting to crack, because an increasing number of companies are now doing something else, right? And when it comes to, well, this is what we've always done, I'm always trying to be careful in not criticizing managers who maybe have built their whole career on being good on the old stuff. And instead of criticizing them, simply get them to understand that, well, there was a time when that was the right thing to do. Now things have changed, and that must have consequences for how we lead and manage. And then, of course, you have this the fear of losing control, which keeps coming back. And my response to that is that I understand the fear, and I acknowledge that it is a possibility that this won't work, that cost will explode and there will be anarchy. So I accept that as a scenario, but only if you accept my scenario, that this actually will work. So we don't agree, but we agree that there are two scenarios. And then we can start to look at the risk picture in both. And let's start with the anarchy scenario. Then my response would be that, well, if it doesn't work, we can go back to the old way tomorrow. Not a single soul will have forgotten how to make budgets. So what's the risk compared to the huge upside potential when this is working? And I'm saying when, not if, because that is what we see over and over again, that when companies do get started, very, very few go back. So I think it's a very compelling risk picture that we see here. Huge upside potential, very limited downside risk.
Yes, and often we know that there is risks in how we are doing today. Things is not. We shouldn't take for granted that there are no risks in the way we
that's also a very good observation.
Yeah. Another question. How would you start implementing beyond budgeting in a big organization like a financial institution? Well,
it depends. I mean, I've seen examples where they started out with pilots in part of the organization. I think Roche, Swiss pharmaceutical company Roche, is a good example. They started out actually in Sweden, in the Swedish operations, and now it's kind of building, moving upstairs. Other big companies, they go for a big bang. So there is no right or wrong. Both routes can work. But of course, at one point in time, you need this to happen in the whole organization, and the whole executive team must be on board at one point in time. But still, don't forget that most revolutions, they do not start at the top. Very often, this is boiling from below, just like with Agile.
Yeah, we often see this pattern of starting from a pilot somewhere. Some teams do something that makes sense and it works better, and then other teams start looking at that. Or when you face some challenges, management starts to look at that, and that's kind of how it starts rolling out.
Volvo is actually another good example. They did a lot of pilots and experiments on cost management to try out different things before they could do it. So there are many ways of doing this.
Okay. More questions. Can you please give some examples of good and bad implementations of directional and ambitious goals?
Well, again, I think there's nothing wrong with ambitious goals, but the way these are set are very, very important, because it's if they are completely unrealistic and just shoved down the throat of the organization with the message you deliver, or then you will face the consequences. If it's just part of the command and control, then that is a bad way of doing it. But if you can get through an involving process to get people to rally around some kind of hairy type of ambitions, that shouldn't be about delivering tomorrow. They would typically be somewhat longer term, then that really can work. And I've seen an example from Equinor. Safety is extremely important for us. One key metric is serious incidents per million worked hours. So SIF, it's called. And some years ago, the level was between 3 and 4, which was pretty good by industry standards. And then our CEO said at the time, hey guys, shouldn't we aim higher? Shouldn't we? Of course, the ultimate aim should be 0, but shouldn't we aim for 0.5 within a reasonable period? And that really ignited the organization to take a step change further on safety. And guess where we are today? 0.5. So again, it's very much about how these goals are set. In general, the best thing is that teams and the organization can set goals for themselves. And we often find that very often these are more ambitious than if they had come from corporate, which is quite interesting.
This reminds me of something that I've been thinking about while you were talking. It's if you are dealing with a model that's more based on event-driven, like you were describing, isn't there a challenge to implement things that are more systemic, like, for example, switching to green energy or implementing GDPR regulations, things that touch on every little part of the company?
Well, we haven't faced that difficulty because, of course, we see that. I mean, there are some things we are working with. You can't kind of jump around all the time, and you have to think long term and stable progress towards that ambition. Other areas, I mean, things suddenly appears. I mean, COVID-19 is a good example. Right? I mean, we are so happy that we didn't enter 2020 with a traditional budget like somebody else did. As one example.
Yeah, I can imagine that everything probably blew up in the middle. Okay, another question. In these times, is it possible to have predictions regarding budgets or the development of a business? How long will we need to have more? I guess what it means, I'm paraphrasing, to have less error in estimation.
Well, first of all, I didn't mention, but this Swedish bank that has no targets, actually, they don't have forecasts either. But I'm not saying they should make forecasts, but I think we again, the only thing you know is that you don't know. And very often we should think more in terms of scenarios than the kind of one outcome thinking. And we should, in any case, never have a million details like you have in accounting. Because accounting is about looking backwards, where details and decimals are sensible and required. The moment you look forward towards the future, there's uncertainty, and that must have impact on how we deal with those numbers. Oops. Yeah. Sorry, I can't talk right now. What's the message? What the call here from? Yeah.
Another question, can you recommend materials or white papers that you can study about agile and lean budgeting models with concrete examples of problem challenges and how to deal with them?
Well, I mean, beyond my book, if you on LinkedIn, I have published a number of articles which are an easier and cheaper way to start. And also check out the Beyond Budgeting Roundtable. There's a lot of good information on that website.
All right. I think on this note is the perfect time to end. We have answered all the questions. If people have questions, they can contact.
Could I say a few things before we?
Sure, please.
Could I say a few things before we close? First of all, there's a number of agile transformations out there. And I would argue that no agile transformation will succeed without also addressing what we are talking about in beyond budgeting. And I think it is hard to scale agile using exactly the same framework and language that was so successful in revolutionizing software development, right? I mean, if you say Scrum to an executive who don't play rugby, I mean, he might think it's some kind of skin disease, and continuous or a sprint is about running faster, right? And so there's something with the language, and so beyond budgeting, we offer a language that the executives, they understand the language. They might disagree, but they understand the language. I think that's one reason. And the other reason is that we are a kind of missing piece in any agile transformation, because unless you address what we say about written, the budget purposes, and also performance evaluation and appraisals, you will never achieve your agile transformation. It will be singing and dancing and nothing else. And the last thing I want to see is that the stuff I've been talking about today, it will happen, and you probably know. And I don't care what it will be called, business agility or beyond budgeting, that's not important. But in 20 years' time, when we look back at what was mainstream management in 2020, I think we will smile a bit, even have a laugh, just like we today smile about the days before the internet. And it isn't that long ago. And as organizations, we can choose to be early movers, vanguards, and get competitive advantage, like many have already, or we can choose to be dragged into this as one of the last ones. I think I know what my choice would be. Thank you very much.
Thank you. This has been great. There's one last question that somebody asked while you were talking. Are there any software tools that can be used to support enabling performance for team, tracking changes, scenarios, adaptability factors within teams as people management based on this performance model?
Software is not important. We are software agnostics. Actually at Equinor, we have a global SAP solution, which has actually been, I haven't been ambivalent view on SAP in some ways, but it has actually helped us to provide transparency and one version of the truth. But it's not about software, it's about what is sitting up here. That's the important thing.
Yeah, and on this note, thank you, Bjarte, very much. This has been a very interesting and insightful session. I have seen these things over and over again in organizations where I'm involved in transformations and where we start hitting various challenges with vocabulary when we talk to executives, with finance departments, with HR departments. So it's always very useful to have a model that looks at the whole organization and look at the ideas of management and not only at how production is organized. So this has been really insightful. Thank you, Bjarte. We are taking a short break and we are coming back with Shonshu after the break.
Very good. Bye, everybody.
Bye.